So I figured out the whole Putin, Trump, Russia, America situation, and I'll explain it to you. Okay, in 1974, there was an act passed and signed into law by President Ford called the Jackson-Vanik Act. Okay, and it was a trade policy. And the policy was that trade in the Eastern Bloc countries was, and it could apply to other countries, but that was really what was focused on at the time, was going to be based on treatment of Jews. It's not a conspiracy. That's how it was stated. It also said ethnic minorities in Eastern Bloc countries, but it was really focused on Jews and explicitly states that. Um, and so it was in general, on one level, it was in general terms, like essentially humanitarian, qualities, basically like friendliness, right? Vague, loosely able to interpret and manipulate terms, and then specifically on immigration policy, i.e., the ability for those Jews to leave, but also for the fluidity of Jews in the Eastern Bloc countries to move around. In general, with international Jewish interests in those countries and outside of them. Now, it's hard to believe a law like that would be passed, but let's think about 1974. Nixon has just been impeached and is gone. VP Ford has now become the president, which he was not expecting to do in 72 when he ran as the VP. Now he's the president 2 years later, not even. And he's now also, not only is he the president suddenly, he's also, and coming in through a very kind of a vacuum period, because Nixon was, a lame duck, essentially, for the last couple of years. And he's coming in. He wasn't a total lame duck in 72, but by 73 and definitely 74 he was ineffective. Maybe you could say 72. But the point is, he's coming in, and he is now also facing an election in 76. So he's just become president in 74. He wasn't expecting that 2 years earlier. Now he's president. He's facing an election he's not prepared for in 76. And it's going to be a tough election for him, given the climate. So he needs allies and he needs funding. Okay? To keep in mind the importance of Jewish organizations and interests in funding, you can look at AIPAC as being the most powerful lobby in the country, but also just specifically look at LBJ in 1967, when the U.S. Liberty is attacked. The Navy vessel spy ship in international waters is attacked by Israel repeatedly after being identified as an American ship, and 2/3 of the crew are killed or wounded. But the ship is not sunk. LBJ started writing anonymously into, I think it was Mother Jones, but it was some magazine, and he was posting as essentially as an unnamed anonymous official, but who's they're vouching for this guy being the real deal at some high position in the government with classified information, and he's writing about how this was a deliberate attack by the Israelis and on the United States. Now, what happened was, this is in 1967. He at that time wasn't sure, but was generally planning on probably running again in 68. Now, what happened was, he was outed by somebody as being the person writing these articles. So suddenly it's out that this is the president who's writing these highly critical articles of Israel. At that point, he realizes that he's not going to have the funding he needs. This is according to his chief of staff, I believe. This is a guy a highly respected guy who spent his life basically in service to the country and in the military, who's saying this. You know what I mean? It's a good source. It's not, you know what I mean, some crackpot or whatever, somebody with a major agenda. And so Johnson realizes that he's not going to have the funding that he needs for his campaign in 68. if he continues in this critical way, if he doesn't correct course when it comes to Israel. Um, so after that point, he completely stops criticizing Israel. He actually he issues essentially a complete blackout on the entire attack. He puts gag orders on the admiral, and everybody involved in the ship and in the incident is told that they cannot speak about to the press. Um, and it just begins a total cover-up of the whole incident. And with this, there's also an interesting thing that happens with a lot of some of the prominent anti-Vietnam War groups also had Jewish leadership and funding. And during this whole period where there's this kind of uh, uncertainty about how the president's going to react to um, this attack by Israel, and he's been outed now, so they know it's him, and he's silent. There's a marked decrease in the activity of some of these anti-Vietnam War organizations. They basically silence themselves and wait. And so then it becomes clear he's not going to say anything anymore. He's done with that, right? Because they could tell for sure, since he was actively anonymously saying stuff, and then boom, it's all done. And with that, he gets he has the security of the backing. Now, he didn't end up running for president. He died a few years later in the early 70s. But so that story alone illustrates 7 years earlier, 6, 7 years earlier in time, the importance that Jewish interest groups had in funding American political parties. They still do today. So we can imagine with Ford how it would benefit him to do this Jackson-Vanik agreement for the Eastern Bloc countries in 74, facing an election in 76, needing allies and coming in like that. Okay. So now in 2012, the Jackson-Vanik Act, trade policy essentially, changes, morphs into something called the Magnitsky Act. Now, that's signed into law by Obama, and it has bipartisan support, and the Magnitsky Act is just an evolving form of the Jackson-Vanik Act, but the Magnitsky Act is now targeted towards Russia specifically. So it's in Eastern Europe. Now it's in Russia specifically, and it's targeting the top people, business leaders and officials in the hierarchy of the Russian leadership, okay, and around Putin. And it's based off of the premise is that there was a Russian official, Magnitsky, who had discovered widespread corruption in the top levels of the Russian government. And he had been jailed, and then he had been eventually allegedly murdered in jail. And so this Magnitsky Act ostensibly was to punish the Russian leadership for this. Now think about that. How many countries have situations like that going on? Corrupt situations, people murdered who are exposing, crime or things people don't want. I mean, that's not a U.S. policy to initiate a major, economic, trade war with somebody like that, with a country like that. But then ask yourself, when, and think about in the exact terms of this law, the Jackson-Vanik law, which was designed to encourage Jewish interests, right? Business, migration, whatever, atmosphere. After the fall of the Soviet Union, who disproportionately made up the oligarchs, who, in some cases it was criminal, in other cases it was just highly egregious ethical behavior, where, for instance, they would give out vouchers, state vouchers, to each Russian citizen, that they would own part of what was formerly a state-owned company. And there were all kinds of tricks that were done to sort of convince a lot of these people who had no understanding of a market, capitalism, in this sense, that these vouchers really weren't worth anything. And so they would buy them from you for a bottle of vodka. And then when it would come to the auction, and people would have to show up to get their part of the company, there'd be a guy who had, thousands of these vouchers that were really, each one belonged to a Russian citizen. But he had tricked them into getting them by various different means, which wasn't maybe technically a crime, but it was highly unethical and against the sort of spirit of the adventure. So those people who rose during that period, and some of these people who owned huge percentages, or of state companies, or whole companies, were disproportionately Jewish. And so when Putin and his hierarchy, his people, cracked down on these guys, these oligarchs, and jailed them, and in some cases, they were killed. It was seen, if you look at the Jackson-Vanik Act, it would have been seen as being an attack on Jewish interests, and those people would have been connected internationally. And the thing is that when you think about this new act, it is not necessarily totally like a foreign act. I'm sure it's international, but the Magnitsky Act is also probably by expats, from Russia, in terms of their interests. A lot of people want to get back at Putin and his inner circle, in the general circles at the top, right? There's a lot of enemies. And so this was a weapon that could be used to do that. And it was uniquely suited, actually, for exactly this dynamic ethnically. In either case, it was a weapon that could be used, but I think it's more than coincidental. And listen, it sounds weird to say this, but it's true. The Jackson-Vanik Act was designed to punish, using economic means, specifically trade, countries that were not open enough for Jewish emigration and for, atmosphere, which is really doing business and whatnot. So, that's what it was. That's not a conspiracy. So, and so what happened was Trump telegraphed in 2015 and 2016 that he was gonna end this policy, right? Now, how specifically he knew about that and the details, I don't know. But the statements he was putting out there were clear that he did not want to continue an antagonistic relationship, and this is a very antagonistic dynamic, to target a country with an act like this. And furthermore, it's the number one issue for the Russian leadership. This is the thing they want to reverse and get rid of more than anything. So that was the clear message being sent, that he wasn't going to pursue this, which is something that goes back, over 40 years in terms of being a tool in the government, and which has been used now since 2012 effectively specifically against the Putin regime. So that would have upset. There would have been a significant number of people in the intelligence community who would be invested in this, maybe even for decades, but specifically just since 2012, who would this is what they do, and so there's this guy saying, hey, I'm going to stop that. So that, I think, I think that's the main thing about how this has all gone on with Russia and Trump. And he wanting to, when Putin's, that lawyer connected to the Kremlin said that she had damaging information on Hillary Clinton, and to set up a meeting through an American businessman named Goldstone. And that meeting was set up with Trump Jr. and Jared Kushner. and it turned out she really didn't have anything on Hillary Clinton, which is, I mean, why would you not want information against your opponent? But what she was really trying to do was trying to repeal the Magnitsky Act as much as possible, neutralize it on behalf of the Kremlin, on behalf of the Russian leadership. And so she offered something like they could get rid of the restrictions on Americans adopting Russian children, because the fact is the Russians don't really have that much to retaliate against the United States with. I mean, they banned Cheney. They banned like guards from Guantanamo Bay from their country, and they stopped the ability for Americans to adopt Russian children. But I mean, they don't have many tools. They're not a powerful economic country at all. I mean, they live off of oil. So, in a very corrupt way. But so the point is that meeting was really, that's now this, big topic all the time, and the Mueller investigation that DOJ is focusing on. That meeting was really just like an ambitious kind of Kremlin connected lawyer trying to get a sense for how they felt about the Magnitsky Act, and trying to just see if they could get anything kind of repealed or pushed back, make a deal so that these restrictions would be lifted to some degree. Which obviously was not in Trump Jr.'s orbit, you know what I mean? And so that was basically a bumbled thing by this Russian lawyer, Natalia, whatever her last name is, because it alienated the situation. You know what I mean? Without even looking at how it's now been magnified, it also just was kind of a clumsy move, But I mean, you can't really. She's ambitious, and she was trying to do something. At least to put it into their minds, you know what I mean? But it was clear that Trump was already thinking this way, so I don't know. Anyway. But as long as the investigation is going on, Trump's hands are tied. So the Magnitsky Act, the extension of the Jackson-Vanik Act is still in play. He can't do anything about it right now. And they're hoping, obviously, that they'll find out he didn't, pay his babysitter 30 years ago and impeach him or something. But at least for now, these policies are in full effect, and his hands are tied. And you look at the comments he's saying now, it's like he's trying to say how much Hillary Clinton would be better for Putin in terms of policies on oil and alternative energy and military development. So he's trying to really push the opposite direction now, yet alone say, hey, let's get rid of this, this shit that I don't think is, and I don't personally believe is right or useful, like these acts. So that's really what it comes down to. And the question of, the oligarchs being Jewish, this act being created for Jewish interests, even if that is not true, which, I mean, those things are both true, it still wouldn't really, I mean, the point is that this is a weapon that was developed in the 70s uniquely and can be applied against Russia for interests. And there's plenty of people with an axe to grind with Putin and with the hierarchy of leadership in Russia who have an economic axe to grind or worse. And this is a way to get at them. And so the point is that the United States its government, its country really, its power is being harnessed and used for special interests of some form or another. Probably international, probably some of them expatriates or even current Russians. And that's not, you know what I mean? That's an abuse, really. It's not in our interest what we're doing. It's not to say we shouldn't care about human rights in Russia, but this isn't the way to do that, you know what I mean? And it's dishonest to say that because one guy exposed corruption in this country and was murdered, that we have launched this, full-on economic trade attack on Russia. You know what I mean? That's a dishonest statement. At least they should say, look, there's some powerful interest groups involved here, and they want to go at Russia, and they want to hit the Putin regime. And this is an act that we can use to do it that was developed in the 70s. So that's really what's going on. I saw a couple articles, I didn't read them, but with the headline, the Magnitsky Act, when I looked this up, because I stumbled onto this stuff in a weird way. through just looking at different historical things and different acts and policies and people in history. Um, there was a there was a student movement in America against the Soviet Union for like the liberation of Soviet Jewry that was created in 1964 till 1983 that I'd never heard about, and was also connected to the sort of radical movement in the United States, um, which was weird to me. And they were talking about how there was this, um, different kind of quote unquote civil rights leaders were saying that comparing black people and Jewish people in the Soviet Union, which was, I didn't, you know what I mean? I think it sounds kind of absurd, but and so then I looked into some of these people, and then I found this act, and then I went to the next act, and then I thought about what's going on. Um, but I haven't heard anyone or seen anything without having extensively looked into it, because how I discovered it, talk about the Jackson-Vanik Act and its origins. It's very peculiar that Ford gets into presidency, and this weird ethnic trade law is passed into law to punish the Eastern Bloc or reward them based on like their friendliness to Jews and openness to emigration. That is a takeover of the effective foreign policy through trade in the Eastern Bloc countries. And then that morphs into this exact act that the Russians really want to get repealed, and that Trump was obviously telegraphing, a willingness to effectively get rid of, however aware of the specifics he was. Um, and that has been weaponized again and morphed to specifically attack Russia and then look into the oligarchs,